In March and April, I'm just itching to get out into the garden and get the whole thing planted. We already have our spring vegetables planted, radishes and beets, cabbage, onions, potatoes, things like that, but I'm just itching. I want to plant my tomatoes and my cucumbers and my peppers. I want to see my winter squash vines going all over the garden, you know, just making a sea of vines. I'm just anxious for all of that to happen. But I know that it's way too early. Here in Appalachia, we have what we call Little Winters. So for generations, people who lived close to the land, you know, 100 years ago, not just farmers, but everyone had to make that garden every year to provide food for their family. So those people, they began to notice that even though like the bitter coldness of winter was over, there was still a couple of little spells of time there where it sure felt like winter, when the cold wind would come whooshing back over the mountains, and it sure felt like winter, even though they knew technically winter was done, the harshness of winter was over. So as time went on, they began to call those, at that same time they would notice those spells happen every year. And also, every time they happen, there's something else going on. Maybe something's blooming. Maybe I hear something. So they began calling those little winters by names corresponding to what was going on in nature around them. So over time, there's been like 6 little winters, as we would call them, kind of documented. Now today you don't hear many people talking about any of them, really, but certainly not all of them. I'll share the ones that were most familiar to me when I began to learn about the little winters, the ones that I had grown up with and the ones that I'd never heard of. But so the first one is still fairly common. You'll hear people talk about redbud winter. So when the red buds are blooming, you can always count on having a spell of cold weather. Typically, you would have some warm days where you might, you know, you're wearing short sleeves, you're thinking about putting your shorts on, and then all of a sudden when the red buds bloom, you have some really cold weather with some hard frost, hard freezes. And you're thinking, well, what, you know, boy, I was fooled. Winter's not completely gone. So that's redbud winter. That's the first one, and that one usually happens in late March. Now, one of those winters that you don't hear many people talk about anymore, one of those little winters, is locust winter. And that one typically happens in early April, but I have never heard anyone talk about locust winter. I have read it, but I've not heard anyone talk about that one. But the next one is dogwood winter, and that occurs in mid-April when the dogwood trees are blooming. And that one is still really common in my area of Appalachia. You'll hear people talk about dogwood winter. So every year when the dogwoods bloom, you know there's going to be a spell, several days of cold weather. You'll have frost. You might even have some snow. So you just know to expect that that's coming. The next winter, little winter, is another one that's really common in my area. It's blackberry winter. You'll hear people talk about blackberry winter. And that occurs in early May when the blackberries are blooming, when those blackberry briars have those wonderful little white blossoms that are telling you about the sweetness to come, you know. That's every year. You can just count on it. Now that little winter, typically it's just cool weather. It's rare that you'd have a frost or a snow, but it's not out of possibility. You could. But that one is as the little winters go on, there's less chance of that hard freeze or snow or something like that happening. But it could. You could never tell. So the next little winter after blackberry winter is whipperweel winter, and you don't really hear many people talk about that one either. And that one occurs in mid-May, and it's when you first begin to hear the whippoorwills. So that's kind of corresponding to that one, whipperweel winter. And the last one happens at the end of May, and this is one I've never heard of. Like the locust winter and the whippoorwill winter I've read about and maybe heard in passing, maybe once or twice, but never really, it's not common. But this one I've never heard anyone, I've only read it, and it is breeches winter. So I've heard it called, or read it called, cotton breeches, Linsey-Woolsey breeches, so different kind of combinations of breeches winter. And I also read that it was because this was at the end of May, just a few little spell of cool weather that made you wish that you had your winter pants back, but your winter breeches, what we would call pants, our breeches. But I find that kind of hard to believe, because most people that I know that would have, like in my family, that would have been alive 100 years ago or whenever these terms come about, they wouldn't have had winter clothes and summer clothes. They just had what they had until they wore it out. But by far, in my lifetime, and even today, the two winters, little winters that are most often talked about are Dogwood Winter and Blackberry Winter. Those are the ones that I'm most familiar with. Out of the dictionary Smoky Mountain English, this is what they have to say about Dogwood Winter. Dogwood Winter is a noun, a frost or freezing spell in mid to late April when dogwoods are in bloom. 1970, Vincent Moore of Best. Sometimes dogwood buds burst into full bloom up here, and the very next day, top coats won't feel a bit too warm. This is what we call in these parts Dogwood Winter. 1982, Smoky's Heritage. In the warmth of spring may come a sudden chill with even a hint of snow. This is Dogwood Winter, usually here when dogwood blossoms hang white upon the trees and wildflowers are beginning to appear. And then in 1994 to 97, the Montgomery collection, he documented that it was a usage still in use. Dogwood Winter was still in use by Adams, Brown, Cardwell, and Shields. So here's a short quote about Blackberry Winter from the book Tall Woman by Wilma Dykeman. I really love that book. And after the cold spell, when dogwoods bloomed, there will be Whipperweel Winter and Blackberry Winter. Dogwood Winter happens in April, but it is soon followed by another spell of cold called Blackberry Winter, which occurs in May when blackberry briars put out their delicate flowers. So Blackberry Winter and Dogwood Winter were the two that I grew up with, that I was most familiar with. I've heard them my whole life. But when I was a small girl and I would hear them, I didn't care anything about it. All I cared about is for someone to tell me when it was going to get warm enough for me to put my bathing suit on and go swimming in the pond. I wasn't concerned about anything, affecting plants or anything like that. Probably in my teenage years, it's when I really paid more attention to it, but I thought that it was nonsense. I thought it was something that Granny come up with just to sound more colorful. So I just thought would probably do my teenage eye roll, when I heard the terms. But it was only as a mother, when I was putting my own hands into the good earth, into the soil each year, and growing a garden, making a garden to feed my family, that I began to really pay attention and to notice, oh, there's something to this. Every year when the redbud trees are in bloom, it gets cold. Every year when dogwoods are in bloom, it's a cold spell. Every year when the blackberries put out their little sweet teas of, or their white teas of sweetness to come, there's a cold spell. So it was only then that I began to really pay attention and realize, yeah, I should have paid attention to Granny and all these people that come before me who had experience with the land and experience growing food for their family. They knew what they were talking about. So if you are someone who lives in Appalachia or where there's little winters, and even though you're tempted, don't be beguiled by those warm March and April days. It's not quite time to plant those tender vegetables outside. But be encouraged. You can go ahead and plant your spring vegetables, which are really tasty too, beets and radishes and cabbages and all those kind of things, lettuces. There's lots of different varieties that you can plant of all of those and more than that. So be encouraged, you can do that. I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me, did you grow up hearing about the little winters in your area if you live in Appalachia, or does this just sound like all crazy stuff to you and you didn't know about the little winters? Either way though, like I said, as an adult, once I was married and I pay attention, it just happens like clockwork. You can just guarantee on every time, like I said, the dogwoods are blooming, there's going to be a cold spell. When the blackberries are blooming, it's going to be chilly for a few days. You can just count on it. And I love that over the years, that folklore, that needed folklore, was passed down from those people that noticed it first in Appalachia, and then they passed it down, even to people, even to Granny, and then even people like me that thought it was all nonsense. But finally, by experiencing it myself, I finally realized they were right, and I'm glad they passed that wisdom down.